Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I'm sharing about Tamaquag's new edition of The Key to the Language of America by Roger Williams, and it's edited by Dawn Dove, Narragansett Elder, my mother, Sandra Robinson, a tribal spouse who has 2 tribal children and is married to a Narragansett tribal member, myself, Dorothy Herman Papp, a friend of the community, and Kathleen Bragdon, a PhD and linguist out of William and Mary, who partnered with us on this project, but has also worked with our language committee for the Narragansett Indian Tribe on other projects in the past. And so we started on this process of thinking about the user-friendliness of this book, the original Key to the Language, during language classes, where on occasion we would look at it as primary source documents, we'd critique it, we'd make comments about things we didn't like that were in the book or errors in grammar that were there. And one of the things that we talked about is that in regards to those kinds of things was that, Roger Williams was an immigrant to a new land, and he was not fluent in the language and was trying to understand, just as if we were plopped someplace else. I like to pick Kazakhstan because I have absolutely no idea how they speak in that location. So I figure if you plopped me there and I tried to figure out what they're saying, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to make assumptions about their culture and their community in ways just because I'm trying to figure it out. And I'm interpreting it based on my life lens, as was Roger Williams. And so as Indigenous people, there's some parts of it we like and some parts of it we don't and have opinions about. And so through the process of creating this new version of the book, we did a couple of things. One, we made the English modern. So for all of you that haven't been studying, 17th century English, it was made user-friendly so that you could just read it and understand what it meant in modern English. So, for example, the first chapter in the original book is called Salutations. If I said salutations to my 20-something children, they'd look at me like I'm stupid. What are you talking about? They have no idea what salutations means. So, we use the word greetings. In the footnotes, it tells you we changed it. So for those that are purists and are like, oh my God, they're changing something, you can look in the footnotes and see the words that we changed in regards to the English and or Narragansett for that matter. But the main goal was to make this book user-friendly for the average American person that is not a historian of the 17th century nor a linguist. We also wanted it to be user-friendly for Narragansett people that might want to use it as a primary source document, since Roger Williams recorded to the best of his ability our language in that time period. It would give us, as a community, a reference guide that they could use. And our community was already using it, along with the Natick Dictionary, along with Eliot's Bible and other kinds of primary source documents. As our community has had interrupted language and is not a completely fluent community today. However, we have continued using the language over time in various forms, through greetings, through songs, through prayers, and through informal dialogue, informal conversations. And so as colonization took place, and at some points in time that was enforced to be against the law to even speak our language, it's a time that now, in the 21st century or before that, that people are reclaiming the right to utilize their language. And an example of that is in naming. I mentioned to you earlier when I did the greeting and acknowledgement of the land and the blessing, I told you my traditional name, Makasini Pashao, and then sort of my Americanized name. Since the Civil Rights era, the American Indian movement, coming off the 60s, 70s, and then beyond, there has been an increasing reclaiming of naming your children actually in the language and on your birth certificate. So my first grandchild, his name is Minakisu Mikwin, which literally means he is strong, and then feather, so strong feather. But if you literally translate it, it really is he is strong. It has to be possessed. And so the idea is that the Narragansett community and other Algonquian-speaking peoples are using these primary sources to help them build their language programs. I'm going to try not to forget what I say sometimes because I said it earlier. I can't remember whether I said it to you now. But one of the things is in our archive at Tamaquag Museum, which is an independent nonprofit and that's been around for 61 years, we have documentation of Narragansett language classes from the early 20th century, about 1930s. And then that was led by Cecil Addison. And then there's documentation, of course, with Ella Sikatow, teaching language classes like, I would say, 70s, early 80s, maybe even to the late 80s. And then my mother, Dawn Dove, teaching language class from the 90s to the 2000s. And so it's been a continuing process that's been ongoing. When we brought in Katie Bragdon on some of the projects that we've done in the language program that we have, it was around, you know, linguistical deconstruction of the language, which my mother is a total grammar geek. You know, she's the person that says, I like diagramming sentences, and everybody else goes, ew, particularly her daughter. So the idea is that she's a purist in that way, and I'm a person that says, if you understood what they said, that's language. We're communicating with each other. You know, you can correct our grammar. I correct my children's grammar all the time. They don't listen and they still say, you know, Robbie and me instead of Robbie and I, you know, that kind of thing. But the point is that the language is still understandable. And that was one of the things that I personally am most interested in, is for the Native community to better be able to communicate with each other in the language. And so that's why I got involved in this project particularly. However, as a museum educator, I also wanted the general public to know more about our community. And Raj Williams talks about our history and culture in this book in lots of different ways. So in the footnotes, we give an indigenous perspective on comments and things that he says. Now, some of them we disagree with. Some of them he just didn't expound far enough on it and just gave you a little glimmer, and we're giving you more. And in others, we're also taking you from the 1600s to the 21st century and reminding you we're still here and still utilizing the language and still connected to that historical content that is being referenced. So the team of folks that I mentioned that are the editors of this book also wanted people to know that it wasn't just us. You know, anytime there's a project, you have to do a lot of work, and it took us like 3.5 years to do this work. And so you can't do it with a group the size of this because we get nowhere, right? But we wanted people to know that, one, the information in this book is what's been passed down through us, through previous generations, ancestors and such, but also in our acknowledgments, we acknowledge the language committee, we acknowledge elders, we acknowledge people that we called up on a particular tidbit that we just wanted to know. We were writing a footnote and we were struggling with it, and we felt that this person in our community had specific knowledge around that area. So when you read the acknowledgments, it's not just thank you for helping us with this book. It really has some nuances about the culture and the community, which you get to know through that. Our book has a preface as well as an introduction, and we wanted people to know that for a reason. The preface was written by me. The group kept nominating me to be the writer on certain things because my mother was the boss of things. And in the let me do the last part of the acknowledgments. So there was like an example here on the very last section of the acknowledgments. We acknowledge a lot of individual people that are in the tribal community that specifically helped on a particular thing. And then we also wanted to acknowledge Neil Safier of the John Carter Brown Library that let us have the digital version of the original Key to the Language of America in order to work from, which was really key. And John McNiff, who's here tonight, who gave us map suggestions and things of that nature. So, and thanks to Bob Geek, who helped us get connected to West Home Publishing. But in the preface, we really wanted to have people think about why we, as Narragansett people, were interested in this book, why we thought there was some value to this book, and why we wanted to undertake this big project to have conversations around the content that's in this book. So you certainly can read all of that yourself. I'm not going to read it for you. But I did want to mention to you the sort of our last line in it is referencing Ella Sikatow, who was the Narragansett tribal ethnohistorian, and the late Ella Sikatow. And one of the reasons why that I really wanted to bring her up is she always said, and I quote, so long as one person is speaking one word of the language, it continues. Because people like to say, Narragansett language is dead. That's what they like to write in books. And is it completely fluent? No. But it is a continuing language. And part of the work that we've done in our language community to continue that was, example, the song that I sang to you earlier, the idea that that was new works, because vibrant languages have new works. Stagnant languages hold on to what was and just stay with that. And I'm not saying that there weren't times in our history that we were just holding on, because we were. But I like to think that through some projects like this one, when you push forth and do new projects, it also gives other young people this idea that they have permission to do so as well, so that they can be writing songs and writing books and writing whatever in the language and pushing that forward, which is really important. Again, the big thing was the English language is updated to modern English. So we talk a lot about that in the introduction and on how we're just making it modern so someone can understand it. Change the font so someone can read it. And you don't have to have old school calligraphy skills to be able to read that. Mind you, that young people today, and when I say that, I'm talking about my children's age, upper teens and young 20s, they can't even read cursive writing anymore. So they certainly cannot read old English fonts. So that was the goal in that. And then the rest was, the goal was to create footnotes that spoke to the linguistics, the rules and style, the cultural knowledge that was commented on in the book, and the historical content. So we did a bunch of things. One thing we did is we added pictures to the book. And of course we tried to make them go with, this is a picture of Princess Red Wing, who was the original founder of Tamaqua Museum, born in 1898 and lived through 1987. She is in front of a weetu, which is a traditional Narragansett home, and it has bulrush and cattail mats on it. And so what we tried to do is put pictures in certain spots that would help the reader understand certain things that are being named in some of the vocabulary that's in the book. And also it gave us an opportunity for people to see images that are in our archive at Tamaqua Museum, as well as cultural materials, or AKA objects or artifacts, which is a word I decolonize and don't like to use. So I like to use the word cultural belongings or cultural materials, because they're connected to a people that are in our collections at Tamaqua Museum. And so we tried to do things that would inspire the reader and give them a little something that would help them to understand the book that much more. So, I think I mentioned the salutations, so let me give you one thing we didn't do is we didn't change the general observations at the end of each chapter. Roger, who we affectionately call RW, did his general observations, which are kind of like little poetry vignettes that he puts out there. And on the most part, we just left them alone. As far as how they were written, the font that they're in, we left them alone. But we did on occasion make a comment in a footnote if something really struck us. So that's something that was interesting. So let me see. So Katie Bragdon, she, Kathleen Bragdon, who's a PhD out of William and Mary, who we've been working with on several different projects, was our PhD on this project. And she brought to it her academic perspective. I will say it was a very interesting collaboration. We didn't always agree, and when I say we, I mean the team, Katie. And in the end, the tribal elder got the final say on what got put in the book and what did not. On occasion, we didn't agree with what she said. Sometimes we left her footnote and wrote our own footnote. And sometimes we said, absolutely not, that footnote has to go. So it was an interesting process in that as well. Katie, utilized her skills. She often also helped us, because on occasion, so when we first started this project, we originally thought it was going to be old version, new version, side by side, so someone academic could literally look at the original page and then look at our page. It would have turned into 3 times the width of this book, so the publisher after a year said, no, we already got that. People can go get that book. They can get the guarded version, they can get Trumbull, they can get the original, they can get it themselves and compare and contrast if they want. We want you to just have your footnotes. But on occasion, we loved a Trumbull or guarded footnotes so much that we were like, we have to put it in. And so they're in the footnotes. If we absolutely felt like we needed to comment on someone else's work, we tied that into the footnotes. And so so sometimes you'll see that in the footnote. So I'm going to try to find a good one. That one's not a good one. But anyway, I will share that as I come along. So in the one where it's talking with the Princess Redwing, I meant to say that. So there was a section, footnote number 4. Where is 4? Why can't I see 4? The text. Oh, here it is. Wachiapuk, I said that totally wrong the first time, is worked finally to make a summer covering for their houses. So it has the footnote, and then that's why we put the picture on the page. So mats were made from a variety of materials, including bulrush, cattail, corn husk, and thinly woven barks. The finer materials were used on the inside and the coarser materials used on the outside. So that's an example of how we gave you cultural context around the vocabulary word. So all throughout the footnotes, we're giving you more cultural and historical and contemporary context of the words and the uses. So another example of that is here we have spoons. Where's the... Why can't I find the word? Okay. Kanam or kanamwag is spoon or spoons. So what we did is we put an image of these historic wooden spoons in the book from the Dawn Dove collection so that people could envision these spoons versus the spoons that are in your kitchen that most people would think of first in their own mindset, so that they would have that connection to the historic spoons. We also did the same in his observation. So in the middle, Roger Williams often had different little observations. So instead of shelves, they have several baskets in which they put all of their household stuff. They have some great bags or sacks made of hemp, which will hold 5 or 6 bushels. And then he has the word takyonk or westkyonk, a pounding mortar. Not promising I'm going to say all this right. My mother's a much better pronouncer than I am, especially when I'm reading it. I'm better when I've just learned it orally. So in here what we did is we put from our collection a mortar and pestle that has acorns inside, because somewhere in the book, I don't know if it's on the same page, it has acorns mentioned as one of the foods that we're eating, so the pounding of a mortar. And for some people, especially average folks, there's not many people that have a mortar and pestle in their home anymore. Now people do buy it for fancy pounding of spices, but that's not a normal thing that's in the average home today. So we wanted people to understand what those things were. So there's parts where Roger Williams, I'm trying to find my son. I know I wrote it on here. Here it is. Made errors. That was the same page. No, that's spoons. Here we go. So the word sun, S-U-N, is how we spell it today. It's a word that you put, like, so if I say sun kunai, it means how are you? But it's a question. The S-U-N doesn't mean how. It means it's a question that you have to answer. And you have to usually, in this context, you have to answer it yes or no, which seems weird in English, but instead of are you well, like, so instead of how are you, literally are you well is the literal translation, and then you would say nuks nunai, yes, I am well, or mata, I'm not well. So in Roger Williams, he forgets to put it in a lot of times, and he doesn't have the question started correctly. Probably because in his literal translation, that word didn't make any sense because it doesn't mean one of the other words in the sentence. It means it's a question. So we added that kind of grammar stuff. So for the grammar geeks out there, they're going to love that part. And for the rest of us, we're going to skim right over it and forget about it. I personally like to go into the cultural context more so than the grammar stuff. But I thought I'd share a couple of points with you about that. In here also, so here's another observation that he writes. The reason they call the Englishmen chakwakwank, meaning knife men, is because of the metal knife, or the chakwank, the English use. Prior to the presence of the English, they used stone instead of metal for their knives, awl, blades, hatchets, and hoes. So then we put a picture of stone points, knives, and scrapers from the museum, but we also wrote a footnote about that. So we wrote, the Narragansett also used bone and antler for awls, scrapers, and hoes. Today, there are still many Narragansett artists using stone, bone, and antler for making tools and art pieces. So one of the things that, as a museum, we made it very important in our goals is to always bring people from the past to the present. In historical books, a lot of time you're just left in the past. And so since all of this took place in the 1600s, we're left in the 1600s. King Philip's War happened in the 1600s. We're gone, we're dead. We are either enslaved somewhere far away, we're invisible. So what we try to do in the work that we do is make us visible. One, we're visible because we're co-editors in the book. But two, we're reminding people that we're still here in the 21st century, and that maybe you might call the people making those things artists today, but they're still people making these traditional art forms. In most cases, not because they're artists first, it's because they're cultural first, and they're doing it for their family and their community and for culture and for ceremony and things of that nature. And then over time, they may do it then for the public at large and actually show at galleries and other kinds of art shows, museums, and the like. But it's because it's our culture first and the art part of it second. Any questions? I'll pause there for a moment because I can roll.
I thought you said it was your grandson that's taking his name on his birth certificate in your native language. What does he do for general society? Does he go by that?
He will. He's only 15 months. But my sisters, every one of my sisters, so my sister's 13 years younger than me, so I kind of grew up post-60s civil rights era, but in the 70s, and it was still pretty negative to be Native. And In the 80s, there became this whole, like, we love a native kind of syndrome after Dances with Wolves came out and the Pocahontas cartoon came out. There was this, like, really, everybody wanted to be native, and there was this, like, renaissance of thinking it's cool in some kind of way. So I was a little more resistant just personally because I figured my kids, I remembered being name called, even though I didn't have an indigenous name on my birth certificate, I had a name that wasn't normal or average. Loren is common now, pronounced differently, but it wasn't common at all when I was a child, so it was a unique name in and of itself. But I was also the one brown person in the school. It's a community of color, if you want to say, but I was the only Indian kid there. So if there was another, it was a cousin of mine in another grade. So with that being said, I mentioned before that people were reclaiming it. Back in the 60s, people started doing it. 70s, more people were doing it. 80s, more. In the 90s and beyond, there's really a lot of indigenous people with their names on their birth certificate, as opposed to having a separate name as their indigenous name. And that was only because of the colonial construct. When colonization happened, it became against the law for us to not have biblical names like John and Mary. And so when people, start fighting for their civil rights, if you will, indigenous rights, they started reclaiming that by naming people in their names. So what's beautiful about that is it helps you remember words. So a relative of mine, her name, she's like probably 40 now, maybe late 30s, and her beginning of her name is Sochipawich. It's a much longer name than that. That might be what would be her first name and middle name, but it's really long. But it starts with this word, Sochipawich, which means it is snowing. I can't ever forget that because it's in her name. So my own sister's kids, they're all, the oldest is Mishitashin, which means storm, Nikeki Wayupai Ottawam, which means otter wind song, Pamukau Wushki Asishkwatawag, which means he who dances for three fires, thinking of Orion's belt. Then there's Yoyachi Nakone Makwantha Mayash, which means he remembers the old ways. And let's see if I can get the twins out. It is Mishinakwish Kawami Awusapai Kisakwash and Mashisha Kawami Wusapai Anakwasag. Got it. Which one is the morning star and all the glittering heavens, and the other is the dawn and all the glittering stars. So, one, it helps keep language vibrant because we're using them. Two, to answer your question about what do you use, when the twincesses went to kindergarten, my sister, their mother, went into school and said, you may not chop their name and give them a nickname. Their names are Mashisha and Mishinakwis. It's not that hard, not any harder than Siobhan, which is a difficult name, especially when you look at it, to say. So it's not that hard. And do you know what? All the kids know how to say their names. Mishinakwis and Mashisha. Not so hard. Now, granted, they didn't have to learn the whole long version of their name, just the first part. And so, Pamakau, people call him that. Some people do call him Pum, but that became a family nickname too, so that is okay. And so as kids get older, they may adopt a nickname, but that's up to them, as opposed to modern American society going, your names are different and hard, so therefore I'm not going to say it correctly. And that's an oppressive tactic. People call them microaggressions. I call them macroaggressions against people and cultures that are diverse. So anyone else have another question?
Do your children go to normal schools, or is there an Indian school here? Well,
they're quote-unquote normal schools, public schools, yes. Most Native kids go to public schools in Rhode Island. I went to local public schools. My husband did. There was an Indian schoolhouse back in the 1700s, maybe going into I don't know exactly when it ended. It might have been right around the turn of the century in the early 1900s. I'm not exactly sure when it ended. It might have been right around detribalization in the 1880s, I'm guessing. I founded a school that was focused on Native history, culture, and the arts called Nuituan School that I ran for 7 years from 2003 to 2010. I did that because I was highly annoyed having been a teacher. I worked in public school. I think public teachers are fantastic. I think the system is systematically oppressive. And it's not individuals, it's the system itself that needs to be rectified. And the reality is it is not inclusive. It does not acknowledge, recognize, nor respect other people's cultures. And as first peoples of this culture, of this place, we should be the most respected people here as far as our culture is concerned. And that's not what happens. However, due to floods and fiscals, we ended up closing that school. But I did send all three of my children graduated from the Met School in Providence or the East Bay Met, and they chose, I may have gave them as a suggestion, but I didn't force them. They could have chose to go back to Charahoe. They didn't choose to do that to the local school. They chose, because I live in Charlestown, they chose to go to the Met School. So when you think about a kid getting up wee hours of the morning, getting driven to Hope Valley, getting on the RIPTA bus, going to Providence, and getting all the way, it's like an hour and a half transport just to get to school, and you get home late because you don't get home till like 5 o'clock, but you got to leave at 7 a.m. They chose to do that because the school allows for the inclusivity of culture, and cultural knowledge is valued. They can do projects around their culture, they can do internships around their culture, they can write about their culture and have it be accepted and not just some separate bubble over there. And they were very happy to do that. That doesn't always work for everyone. Everyone doesn't always have a parent or a set of parents that can do all that running around. So we do a lot of advocacy work through Tamaqua Museum and our Indigenous Empowerment Network with local public schools. And Silver Moon LaRose, who's our assistant director, she's working directly with Charahoe right now because the statistics are there. The State Department looks at the disproportionality of service for certain particular finite groups. Unfortunately, because our numbers are so small, when you look at it in the totality of everyone else, you kind of fall off the graph. But when you take it and do it in its own silo, we're statistically underserved in so many different ways. Highest rate of dropout, highest rate of suicide across the country, highest rate of murders, and lowest rate of people graduating from high school, lowest rate of people getting into college, lowest rate of people graduating from college. There are people like myself that break that statistic, and there are a lot of us, but when you take the whole group, there's a little of us that have broken through those barriers that are there. But that's another whole talk, and so let me segue back. Anyone else have another question before I go on?
Do you have some kind of a pronunciation key in this book about how to say some of these words? Or I know you had a problem with a couple how to say it.
Well, it's just Narragansett, it's hard.
The question?
Say that again?
Can't hear the question.
The question was, do we have a pronunciation key? The answer is there's not a pronunciation key in the book. However, if you go to the Roger Williams Initiative site that was done for schools through the John and Letitia Carter Fund at the Rhode Island Foundation, if you go, I think if you keyword like Finding Roger, or if you just do Roger Williams Initiative, you go to that site and there's actually my mother saying a lot of the language. I was randomly opening pages and whatever word was there, so I was trying to say it the best I can. I will admit sometimes I stumble on Narragansett words. They're long, they're hard, they've got lots of prefixes and suffixes added to them. Some stuff I use regularly, and when it's just like in English, if you do and talk about it all the time, you get fluid with it. In other words, I haven't seen until I opened that book to that page, and I'm like, how am I going to do that? And so, I wouldn't profess to be the best one on pronunciation. I'm sure my mother would say I pronounce lots of things wrong. I think she even says I pronounce my own name wrong, Makasini Pashao. You accent things certain ways differently than other people. And she would be like, the correct way to do that would be this. And because she's the grammar queen. But we tease because it really doesn't matter. If you say Nitonis versus Natonis, we both know that means my daughter. It's the same word, but people are saying the prefix slightly different. But it's also recorded in Roger Williams' spelled lots of different ways. It's spelled in Roger Williams with N-I-T instead of N-U-T, and the N-U is the prefix that most modern Narragansetts use for the prefix for my. And he uses it intermittently throughout the book, but on the word Natawnus, he spells it with an I. So people in modern English today, you see a short I and you say nit, Natawnus. And you see a U, you say Natawnus. So you get influenced by the 21st century on how you say something. If you say Askuwikwasin, which is one of the most common ways people say hello in Narragansett, but we often spell it A-S-C-O. Well, people see an O and they put a hard O sound or a long O sound and say Askuwikwasin. Well, guess what? If I say Askuwikwasin or Askuwikwasin, you still, if you know what the word is, you're still knowing I'm saying hello, right? So I call it potato, potato, tomato, tomato. It's just accents. If you go to Minnesota, you go down to Mississippi, we all sound different. We say things just slightly different. So people can argue about it or we can communicate with each other. And I prefer the communicating part. Yeah, so yes. Iroquoian is another umbrella. You go out west, one of my daughter-in-laws, she's Paiute Shoshone from Nevada. I can't even remember what her language base is, but it's a different umbrella language. I want to say, I better not guess because I can't remember what it was called. But it's completely different. It's not the same at all. And so just as in European languages, you have different languages that fall under different language umbrellas, so do indigenous languages.
So did the different tribes just know the different dialects of different, did they just know each other's dialects?
Well, it's just like if someone lives in Portugal and someone lives in Spain, you can understand the root words of that. Yeah. Like if you're Italian and you go to Spain, you know enough of the root word of all of that to make some heads nor tails of what's being said. Do you say it properly? Probably not. But do you have enough language to get by? Yes. So if you're an Algonquian speaker, so for example, Ojibwe is an Algonquian language. They've been pushed a little west of here now. Some bands of Ojibwe people are actually in North Dakota today, but that was not where they were originally from. But they are Algonquian speakers. So if you write it down, they use a different alphabet, a different English alphabet to write down Ojibwe. Or a different European alphabet. I don't know how to say that. But anyway, you get what I'm saying. Instead of the alphabet that Roger used. And so when I look at Ojibwe, I go, I don't understand that. But if I listen to Ojibwe, I can hear the root words that are similar to our own. I've had tribal elders from the Ojibwe community come visit Nuitawan School and do a whole opening prayer in their language. And I could understand probably 3/4 of it because I could understand the root words that were there. And they were similar enough, but they do have prefixes and suffixes, and they do have dialectal word choices that are different than ours, that I didn't understand as well. Like they use a greeting miigwech, but that's not a greeting we use. It's a different greeting. But there's lots of greetings and things, that's how it goes. So there's differences that way. Yeah. Yes.
Just to follow up on that question, like the Romance languages all developed from Latin, would there have at one time been a Proto-Algonquian language that everyone spoke, and then as people
I really can't answer that as a non-linguist. I don't know if, I imagine there's a potential that that's true, that at some point there was one language, and English is English, right? But if you go to Mississippi and try to listen to what somebody says in a really country town in Mississippi, which I have some relatives that live down there, I have no idea what they're saying. I'm struggling, and it's English, and I can't understand what they're saying. Because the dialect and the accents are so strong, and the way they pronounce a word, well, people come to Rhode Island and what do they say to us? Oh, we got an accent. We said lobster. That's because of us Narragansett people, Actually, in our language, we have no R's. It's pretty ironic that the English spelling of the Narragansett word, it has R's. So it's really nahaiga. Where you have R's, we have a sound. So nahaigansek. And so it's really ironic, but we never had any R's in our language. And in our community, we actually have a speech impediment that's pervasive where people actually can't say R's. Matter of fact, when I was young, I remember a young Narragansett youth, teenager, at the time, they were doing a partnership. Princess Redwing was leading it. They were doing the whole meeting of Roger Williams with Canonicus and so forth, whatever. Well, this young Narragansett person was supposed to say Roger Williams and could not get the R out. And so my cousin Gary actually ended up doing that role because he could get the R out and to say Roger Williams. Instead it was Roger Williams, you know, that kind of thing. If you picture little kids, they put all the W's where the R's are. But that's pervasive in our community. We joke about it, but it's actually true. And a lot of kids go to school and get speech therapy to get the R out. So one of the things that we tried to do with this book is really like incorporate oral history as well as documented history that was inaccurate or not fully expressed in this book. We used a lot of archival resources. I think I mentioned that to you, the pictures, but also maps. Our archivist, Tony Belts, he really helped us a lot in getting permissions for using the maps that we have in this book. It was quite an ordeal getting maps and permissions from those early historical maps. And you know, we utilized folks in our community that had specialized skills as well. One of the goals is continuation of language. It's also continuation of knowledge. This is an opportunity to record this much of our history, but in the context of this structure, to share with the general public, but also to share with our youth as they're coming up, and also to empower them with the language, but also with cultural knowledge that they can share as they grow and add to. It's important to us to pass this on to the next generations that come. I think of my own children. I think of my daughter, who's a sophomore at URI. She left the house for her college dorm last year with the key to the language and Natick dictionary under her arm. Like, I love that because it was important to her to have the ability, if she didn't know the word by heart, to have some place to look it up if she wanted to incorporate it in the work that she does. She, as well as many other Native youth, feel empowered by speaking the language. And they feel especially empowered when they say Machamokwik, which means you stink. So anything they thought was funny or naughty, they grabbed right a hold of. As any kids do, whenever we learn a foreign language, we learn the foolishness first. But that's what empowers us to keep going. I wanted to tell you about give you another example of a footnote in here. My 53-year-old eyes need the glasses now. So, footnote, this is another observation. So it says, many of them, natural princes, or else industrious persons, are rich. The poor among them will say they want for nothing. Well, one, he's speaking to the fact that we were a community that there really was no poverty, because you had a communal way of living in which things were transferred from one place to the other. One of the things that we talk about in the museum sometime is gaming, and playing games like Moccasin Game, Hubbub, and other kinds of games. Table games, if you will, but also games in general, were used as a way to move, and if you want to use this word, it's kind of a Western construct, wealth around. It was a way to get things to people who need them, but you come together in a social gathering. You have your ceremony, which is spiritual. You have your feast to give thanks. You play games to have fun, but in that process, you also can move things around the communities as is necessary, so that everybody has what they need or what they need. But in this footnote here, in reference to the word princes, this is our footnote. Williams refers to the Narragansett with the royal title of princes. often in reference to leaders from each village as well as leaders of the tribe as a whole. The Narragansett did not have royalty in the way that was common in Europe at the time. The Narragansett cared for their whole community and shared the resources. A person was considered most respected when they gave to others. There was not the concept of poverty nor wealth in a Western way of thinking. The community worked together for the common good of all. Even today, tribal members who hunt, fish, or gather not only share with those in their immediate families, but with elders, the sick, and others that are not capable to participate in those activities. And so, just as in that footnote, we went from the past to the present, when it's possible, we try to do that. We try to remind the reader that we're still here, we're living in the 21st century, we're connected to those cultural what we call TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, that cultural knowledge of hunting and fishing and gathering, medicinals, edibles, materials that are to make other things that are useful, all of that kind of thing. And we still do that today. The difference is today we're doing it above and beyond our modern 21st century day job and not as our job. You know, historically that would have been your job, and today, you know, I'm a museum director and educator, and in the past, those kinds of jobs. So when I do traditional art forms like beading and weaving and basket making or pottery or any of those things, I'm doing them extra and over and above. And if I'm out in the woods collecting resources for those things, I'm still doing that as extra, but it's still part of who I am today. And so we wanted to have that come across in the book, that people, although we're talking about a historical time period in the book, we wanted people to be aware that people are still doing these things today. I'm guessing by the clapping we must be out of time, so I'm going to let you ask any question you might have, and then I will pause there, and you'll just have to read the book to get all the rest of the wonderful things that are in there.
Can you talk a little bit about the museum? And also
Sure, and I have brochures up here, so feel free to come and grab some. So Tamaqua Museum is Rhode Island's only Indigenous-run museum, and then in 2016 we won the highest award in the whole entire United States, the Institute of Museum Library Services National Medal, which was quite fabulous. Got to meet First Lady Michelle Obama, or former First Lady Michelle Obama, to receive that award. And so we focus on the history of indigenous peoples, but with a focus on Narragansett and Niantic peoples and how they intersect with other tribal nations around the region, and for that matter in the 21st century across the continent. But the focus is southern New England and Narragansett and Niantic. Our educators are all indigenous. We do it from a first-person perspective, weaving the history and culture through the individual educator's lens. Yes?
Where is it?
In Exeter, Rhode Island. You can grab one of these. It's got a website. We have lots of great resources that connect to Roger Williams. We partnered in Mosaic, the podcast by NPR, in episodes 3 and 4. You'll hear my voice. 5 and 6 talk about the Brothertown indigenous experience of migration out of this region. So those 4 are, the whole series is on immigration, but those 4 are tied into, the number 3 is Roger Williams and Narragansett people, number 4 is Pequot Massacre, I think, and then the other 2 are Brothertown. We also partnered, I think I mentioned to you, the Roger Williams Initiative. You could also look at the roadtour.org, the First Peoples Road Tour we did as well, in partnership with the Rhode Island Council on the Humanities. All of those things and many others, if you go to our website and scroll down until you find the resource button, we link all those things. So we talk about the landing portrait that's at RISD. That's supposed to be Roger Williams meeting the Narragansett. It's a fictional piece of art because the person took a lot of artistic license 200 years after it happened. And so we talk about how sometimes that picture in a history book is worth 1,000 words, but they're the wrong words. So there's a lot of resources there that you might find interesting that you can use. And Tamaqua Museum, of course, we're open every week for group tours and off-site programs where we come to you, but we have drop-by days for the general public on Wednesdays 10 to 5 and Saturdays 10 to 2, or we do family tours by appointment. So yeah, so we do all those things. and many others. So that's the brief version of Tamaqua Museum. Yes.
I was wondering about the impact of Narragansett on English language today. Is there anything in the book about that, or do you know any books that have?
I feel like we commented about the R issue in here, but I can't remember, and I didn't bookmark that. In the first group, you'd know I had bookmarked a bunch of stuff. When I got here, I didn't have the book that had the bookmarks in it, so I had to re-bookmark. So sometimes I was random as to what I was doing. So I think we comment about the R.
So I know there's
in
a lot
there.
of like words like squash or.
Well, yeah, a scooter squash is a Narragansett word. There's lots of Narragansett words, Musquamaket, Uskapog, Weekapog, Quanakintog, Patuxet, Pawtucket, you just keep going. The list just goes on. But there's a lot. I don't know as though we focused on that. Maybe if it came up in a footnote, it might have. I just don't recall. I mean, there's footnotes like literally on every page in the book, so I can't remember that. Whether we reference that kind of thing of that it's in the English language, but we may have, because the word like moccasins, they use that word all across the country. It's an Algonquian, aka Narragansett word. And it's used from here to California now as Indian shoes, but it's from the word mockas, meaning one shoe, moccasinash, meaning the pair or more than one shoe. And if you listen to it, moccasinash, the that's the prefix that's on the end, they just turned it to in instead of un, but that's what makes the plural. The ash makes the plural. They dropped the ash and added s, so moccasin and versus moccasinash. So there's quite a few words like that, but thank you for bringing up squash, which often those words are chopped or truncated as well, because I think it's closer. I mean, even I'm not necessarily, I'm sure, sounding like my ancestors from 400 years ago, but a scooter squash, it's a much longer word. Chipachinaatak is choker. It literally translates the thing with which you wrap around your neck, aka choker. But it's a long word. And a lot of Narragansett words are long words. And I think because as Americanized as we all are, we're pretty lazy as people. So if it's long and hard to say, we find a way to shorten it. So I think that we even unconsciously do that. Even with our own language, I'm sure there's places where it's ooh and ah together, and unless you studied the grammar of it, you just see O's and you go ooh and move on. But it's really ooh, and if they have the circumflex there, then you know that. But some people don't understand that the circumflex makes it say and if you don't know that, when you're reading as a Narragansett person the key to the language, and you see Nawamini tonk, you just say an oo or an o sound instead of an sound, because you just don't know better. And in some of the books it doesn't have the circumflex because they didn't have the technology to put it in the book, and so sometimes that's not there to help you to know. I mean, we even have things at our museum that's on the wall that just was made at a time that we didn't have a computer that we knew how to make a circumflex, even though we knew it belonged there. So there's 3 O's in a row. If there's 3 O's, you can pretty sure it's oo and together. Oonk. Like that.
It seems to me that English is the dominant language in the country. So I would assume that some of these native languages throughout the United States, where there's small tribes or that, if they're not really careful, their language is going to completely die out.
Yep, that's been the attempt all along.
So I assume that's what you're trying to be very careful with your native language. How are you doing?
It's a daily struggle, I'm sure, because our language has been interrupted. It was against the law at periods in history for us to speak the language. It was against the rules for us to put them on our birth certificates. It was against the rules to speak it in school. That is the domination of conquest, and if you erase the language, you erase some of the culture, because some culture you can't get back when the language is gone. There are things that are non-translatable equally into another language. That's true for virtually any language in the world. Things don't translate exactly the same. And so you lose some of who you are and some of your culture. But I think, there's language reclamation projects all across the nation for indigenous nations to continue and reclaim the use and and knowledge of their language, and we continue to do so. I feel like our community continued on. It was not fluent. I'm never going to lie to somebody and say it was completely fluent. It's not fluent now. Fluency requires a lot of people to be fully fluent, and we don't have that. But what we do have is lots of people speaking lots of the language through song, through prayers, through greetings, through light conversation, through various kinds of works. Just like the new works that I mentioned when I sang you the song Kanashawang earlier. That's us using the language today. Do we sound like our ancestors from 400 years ago? Absolutely not. But do you sound like your ancestors from 400 years ago? No, you don't either. So if we went back in a time bubble, people would really go, oh, what are you saying? The reality is language is ever evolving, and the key to language is understanding each other. And if they understand you and you understand them, then you're speaking the language, and they're continuing it forward. So it's really important. I mean, my grandson knows what mata means. He's 15 months old. He knows that that means no, and he knows that clearly. I say chapachinat to him, and that's give me a kiss. He knows what that means. It's something that our community and our families keep doing. I mean, sometimes you'll come in our house and we'll have everything labeled in the kitchen, trying to keep it in people's heads, to learn the words. But, if I want to say he is laughing, all I got to think of is a family member whose name is Ahanu. It means he is laughing, literally. And so, to me, those names and those songs and those stories that are in our language, they help us also when we're trying to grapple with trying to say something to push that forward. But there are words we don't have. I told this to the first group. When our language is interrupted, you don't get new words because there's not, at that moment, vibrancy in the language to keep thinking about. When you're thinking about survival, you're not thinking about, do we have a name for wagon or car? No, you're not thinking about that. So my mother's forever saying Jakwat Katasiyank, which means, what are you doing? And I often am in my car, and so I early on kept wanting to say I'm Neen Ut, and I didn't know the word for car. So I at first was just saying car, and then one day I said to her, Neen Ut you nene ayumewat. And she paused and she thought about it and then cracked up laughing, because what it literally means is I'm in my 4 horses. 4-horse engine, I'm in my 4 horses. And she thought that was funny. So it's language, though. We've been using that as the word for car now for probably 10 to 12 years. If other people in our community adopt that word for the word car, over time, that's going to be the word car in our language. Car, vehicle, whatever. And that's how language evolves. I mean, we didn't have a word for internet 10 years ago or whatever, many years ago it was, either. And so those, yeah. So those are the kinds of evolution of language. And if more and more young people in our community are very intrigued by language. Lindsay Montanari, who was one of our educators, she's gone back to school, and she's focusing on language as part of her schoolwork for college. She taught one of our series of Children's Hour, and every time we do Children's Hour now, every week there's an introduction of a new vocabulary word. But Children's Hour is for everybody. There's native, non-native kids, people who live in Rhode Island, tourists who show up. That week, whatever the word is, they're learning it. If the word is deer, they're learning a tuk. And that's the word. They got a picture, they got the word, they got it in the singular, they got it in the plural. That's the word of the day. And so that's how you continue to bring it forward. And, I think that Roger Williams documented it. It's one source of early documentation of our language. It's not a perfect documentation of that language, but it's a good documentation of that language, and it's adequate documentation of our history of what was going on at that time. There's things he got wrong, there are things he left out. What he really wanted to be able to do was do trade. So he, in areas of trade, he really focused in on language. In areas of spirituality and religion, he went astray because he wasn't as interested in knowing about our true values and spirituality in that way. So So in the footnotes, we speak to those things that he got right and continued on, and things that he didn't. We're totally out of time.
We are. We have to move it. We have to move the program along.
Yes.
Very, very good. You're welcome.